Good day everyone, my name is Jan Anisi Sukilio and I will be going to present the New York School movement. What is New York School? New York School refers to an American group of poets and artists, part of the postmodernism literary movement, who live in New York City and produce work during the 1950s and 1960s. The New York School movement. The New York School namesake is the École de Paris, which included artists such as Henri Matisse and Picasso. As a term, the New York School was invented in the literary studies by Donald Allen's The New American Poetry on 1945 to 1960s or 1960, in a poetry anthology that presented post-World War II poetry in a number of selected groupings, including San Francisco Renaissance and New York School. When we say École de Paris, it is a pre-World War II group of painters who live and work in Paris between 90s to 1940s. As reflected by its name, the New York School originated in New York City. This movement is not associated with literal school. Instead, it refers to a creative community with similar artistic styles and subject matter. Much of the poetry produced by writers associated with New York School was focused on everyday events and topics, featuring references to popular culture, conversational language, and humor. As a subgenre of the postmodernist literary movement, the New York School sought to break away from traditional styles associated with academia. This movement can be considered as antithesis of confessional poetry, discussing contemporary issue in a light-hearted rather than serious manner. So when we say confessional poetry, it is a poetry style that originated in USA during the late 1950s that focuses on the serious or taboo issues such as personal trauma and sexuality. The New York School is commonly divided into two generations of poets. Let's take a look at the most famous poets from each of the generations. The New York School first generation is Frank O'Hara, James Schuyler, Kenneth Koch, and John Ashbery were all the early members of the New York School of Poets. They moved to and lived in the New York School during the 1950s. At this time, events such as the Second Red Scare and the Korean War was influencing the American political culture and the social discourse. The fear of communism generated by the Second Red Scare led to censorship and intellectual suppression. Through their poetry, this group of writers attempted to find their own escape from the suppressive culture at the time, creating pieces that reflected on the current issues and broke the traditional poetic conventions. First, let's discuss Frank O'Hara. Frank O'Hara was an American poet and curator at the Museum of the Modern Art who lived in 1926 to 1966. O'Hara wrote a poetry about his own personal experiences. Through his work, he sought to capture the rhythms and realities of everyday life and present them in a real-life way to readers, stating that poetry should be between two persons instead of two pages. Next poet is John Ashbery. John Ashbery was a critically acclaimed American poet who lived from the 1927 to 2017. During his lifetime, he won the multiple awards, including the Pulitzer Prize, the Yale Younger Poets Prize, and the MacArthur Genius Grant. He is best known for his 1975 collection, Self-Portrait in the Convex Mirror, for which he won a Pulitzer Prize. Ashbery poetry is characterized by how it is pushed the boundaries of the typical structure in verse. For instance, the Tennis Court Ode on 1962 contained multiple poems which broke away from traditional forms and expectation. The longest poem in the collection, Europe, was divided into three sections and contained references to the 1917 novel Beryl and the Biplane by William Leigh Hughes, among the other popular media. The last one is James Schuyler. James Schuyler was a poet who lived in the 1923 to 1999. In 1981, Schuyler was awarded as a Pulitzer for his poetry collection, The Morning of the Poem, on 1980. Prior to this, Schuyler received the Longview Foundation Award in the 1961 and Frank O'Hara Prize for Poetry in 1969. During the 1950s, she shared an apartment in the 14th Street in Manhattan, New York, with Frank O'Hara and John Ashbery. His was known for his window poems, which act as accounts of the view from Schuyler's apartment at the time of writing. For instance, in his poem is The February on 1954, Schuyler described the street at 5 p.m. on the day before March 1st. Alongside producing a number of poetry collection, Schuyler worked as an curator at the Museum of the Modern Art and wrote for the publication of Art News. The first generation of the New York School was influenced by the abstract expressionism art movement. That influence can be linked to many of the school prominent poets working in art galleries. For instance, both Frank O'Hara and James Schuyler worked at the Museum of Modern Art. The New York School second generation. The second generation of the New York School was not tightly linked to the New York City as the first generation. For instance, Alice Notley, Ted Beringan, and Bill Bergson all studied at the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma. Similar to the first generation, these poets broke the traditional rules of poetry. It has been argued that the second generation was more influential by the pop art movement than the abstract expressionism. Alice Notley. Alice Notley was one of the prominent poets of the New York School second generation. Born in 1945, Notley has published a total of 40 poetry collections during her lifetime. Her work added another aspect to the New York School, exploring aspects of womanhood and everyday life. Notley poetry collections including 165 Meeting House on 1971, When I Was Alive on 1980s, and The Descent of Alit in 1996. Ted Beringan. Ted Beringan was an American poet and the husband of Alice Notley up until his death on 1983. Beringan's work was heavily influenced by the Beat generation. Taking an expressionist style, he believed that poetry should be not limited to expressing one idea or subject, but instead should allow a follows the mind stream consciousness. Beringan's most famous work, The Sonnets on 1964, was privately published at first, before being reissued on 1966 by Grove Press. So in literature, when we say stream of consciousness, it refers to a narrative style that parallels to the continuous flows of an individual mental processes. And the Beat generation, it is a literary movement characterized by a rejection of traditional poetry forms and structures, focused on exploring American culture and human condition. The New York School doesn't just refers to a group of poets. The term also refers to an art scene in 1940s. New York, following the Second World War, as an art scene, the New York School is characterized by individual expressionism who broke traditional expectation of art. This style of art came to known as an abstract expressionism. So, the famous New York School artists include Jackson Pollock on 1912 to 1956. Next is Mark Rothko on 1903 to 1970. Next is William D. Koenig on 1904 to 1977. New York School poetry examples. Although all the poets associated with the New York School movement were influenced by the Expressionism, their style were not constrained to the strict set of characteristics or techniques. Therefore, the poetry produced by the poets of the New York School is defined by individualism, representing the writer's own experience and thoughts. Both Frank O'Hara, Why I Am Not a Painter on 1957, and Ted Beringan, Wrong Train on 1971, are written with the stream of consciousness narratives. However, while I Am Not a Painter follows the speaker on thoughts on why he is a poet rather than a painter, Wrong Train explores a more essentialist topic following the thoughts of a speaker as they wait for a train to the afterlife. The New York School of Poetry has three characteristics. The first one is observational subject matter, the second one is the witty tone, and the third is the experimental punctuation. Let's discuss each and every one. The first one is observational subject matter. The majority of work produced by the second generation of the New York School of Poetry sought to provide a commentary on the social and political issues at the time of writing. Due to the observational nature of these poems, an element of spontaneity characterized the style of writing. As the poets would react to the daily events and happenings, Many poets utilizing stream of consciousness narratives to create an in-the-moment feel. For instance, in The People of the Future of Den Bringan in 1977, creates a conversational tone with the simple language of enjambment. People in the future, while you are reading these poems, remember, didn't write them, I did. Here, the enjambment allows the poem to stop and start in a natural way as thought the poet is considering their next word. The poem is not confined to a set of rhyme scheme or a structure, instead it functions similar to a conversation. The second one is the wit tone. A witty and a humorous tone characterize poems produced by the New York School. This style of poetry developed in opposition to the traditional, melancholic and serious approach taken by the World War II of poets. When discussing the current events, although poems from the New York School dealt with a serious issue, they did not so in a conversational way with the moments of humor. The third one is experimental punctuation. So, some of the poems from the New York School utilize direct speech, involving speech marks, while others use little to no punctuation at all. This varied and experimental use of punctuation allowed the poets of the New York School to convey their perspective and emotions by disrupting the traditional rhythms and rhymes associated with poetry. For instance, in the 30th birthday on 1993 by Alice Notley and then Sir Lice, limit her use of punctuation and utilize the enjambment. This use of structure create a choppy rhythm with pauses between each line, creating the sense that we are reading the speaker internal dialogue. In summary, the New York School refers to an American group of poets and artists, part of the postmodernism literary movement. As hinted by its name, New York School originated in the New York City, and it was prevalent as a literary movement during the 1950s and 1960s. The New York School consists of the two generations. The first generation includes Frank O'Hara and James Scholars, while the second generation includes Alice Notley and Ted Beringan. So the key characteristic of the New York School include observational method, witty tone, and experimental punctuation. So that's all. Thank you.